All right, I'll spare you my stupid joke this time. So, and wrap this thing up. In part 3, I asked a couple questions. The main one being, are the comparisons in these failure versus non-failure studies relevant to real-world training? The answer is no, they are not. Comparing 3 sets to failure versus 6 sets to non-failure has nothing to do with hypertrophy training when people are regularly recommending 6 to 8 sets of 1 to 3 reps in reserve or 10 sets or faffing about like Mike with 20 sets. We can't equate volume and draw any meaningful conclusions or say that 3 sets to failure generates more or less fatigue than 8 to 10 sets at 1 to 2 reps in reserve. Those studies haven't been done. Any conclusions are completely preliminary, are in just a group of volume-obsessed fitness people back-arguing their pre-existing conclusions and biases. Now I want to see those studies done. I want to see valid comparisons done. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right. But until we have that data, drawing conclusions is ignorant. Okay. That led into the longer discussion where I introduced something called the FIT equation, frequency, intensity, time, and type, which needed to be modified for weight training. And I've reproduced the applicable equation here with some explanation. All right, so the weight room FI-VT equation will be frequency, weekly muscle group frequency, intensity, repetitions in reserve. Volume will be the number of work sets between failure to 4 reps in reserve. This includes both weekly and per workout set count, reps between 6 to 30 or 35, and failure is true physiological muscular failure. Not technical failure, not volitional failure where you decided to stop because you're too wimpy to push hard. Physiological muscular failure, you can't do another rep no matter how much effort you give. And then type is exercise, choice, the exercise that you do. And I use that to go into discussion of the interactions during a workout. And the primary variables I focused on were intensity and volume. And simply as one goes up, the other must go down, and vice versa. So if you want to train closer to failure or 0 reps or at failure, the amount of volume that you will be able to do or should do will go down. And most of the really heavy failure groups, HIT and the super slow guys, tend to do very low volumes per workout. Similarly, as the volume you're willing to do, maybe you're time constrained, maybe you've got a body part in maintenance, goes down, the higher the intensity must be. If you're only going to do 3 sets per muscle group, you best damn well train to muscular failure, or at least a true 0 reps in reserve. And similarly, as the volume you want to do goes up, 6, 8, 10, 15, 20 sets, whatever during a workout, the relative intensity must come down. You cannot do 10 sets to true muscular failure. You probably can't do 10 sets at 0 reps in reserve. You might have to start that volume at 3 reps in reserve, and it may drop during the sets of a given exercise. Some systems, you take the final set of an exercise to failure. Not in mine. Trust me, other people advocate training to failure way more frequently than I ever did. Mike, be a man, acknowledge your error, and correct it. That's what men do. And similarly, as the intensity you're willing to put out, maybe you train like a baby. Maybe you know that failure burns you out. The amount of volume you must do goes up to compensate for the lesser intensity. That's the only way to get a training effect. Now, exercise plays a role here, right? Obviously, you can do a lot less intense sets of squats than barbell curls. I didn't really get into that because that would take hours to get into the full variables. So that's within a given workout. And as I ended the last piece with, now it's time to get complicated because now it's time to introduce the 4th variable, which is training frequencies, and look at the weekly interactions of all this. So keeping all the previous per workout stuff in mind, let's add another variable, which is training frequency, to look at weekly patterns. Now, I brought this up a little bit already when I brought up the point that, okay, great, so we have these studies showing that neuromuscular fatigue is increased going to failure, but has gone by 48 to 72 hours. If you train once a week, why does this matter? If you train twice a week, say Monday, Thursday on an upper, lower, or push-pull legs, whatever, why does this matter? If you train every 5th day, 3 times every 2 weeks, why does this matter? And the answer is that it doesn't. It matters for athletes who are training things every 1 or 2 days. But for bodybuilders, unless you're on the high frequency fad. None of this matters. Even if you are doing this high frequency nonsense, there's two assumptions here. The first is that 3 by 10 to failure is necessarily going to cause more fatigue than 8 sets at 1 to 2 reps in reserve, or 10 sets or 20 sets of screwing around like Mike does. And those studies haven't been done, but these studies can address that. But the second assumption is that any of this even matters, that these small changes in neuromuscular fatigue and bar speed kinetics have any relevance to bodybuilding training. These things don't have any relevance to your cable curls and your cable crossovers and your leg extensions or your leg presses. They don't. These researchers are looking at this stuff for athletes, not narcissists seeking hypertrophy. And if any of these supposed fitness professionals were honest about it, and even if they knew what neuromuscular fatigue is, and I question that they do at this point, or honestly reported on these studies, they would tell you that A, these studies aren't relevant, and B, this crap doesn't matter for hypertrophy. It never has and it never will. It matters for real athletes. But irrespective of that, now that we're looking at weekly patterns and have 3 variables, and I'm still kind of skirting on the exercise choice thing, we get into more complexities, because now, as any one variable changes, at least one and possibly 2 other variables must change with it. So if you want to work at a higher relative intensity at 1 or more workouts, the frequency or the volume per week or per workout must go down. As the volume per workout you want to do goes up, or the frequency goes up, the relative intensity of any of those workouts, or some of those workouts, or all of those workouts must go down. As the frequency you want to train at goes up, the volume per workout will have to go down, or the intensity has to change, which might allow more per workout volume. And I think you see how complex this can get, because you end up, when all is said and done, with essentially an unlimited number of possible combinations. We know there's two combinations that won't work. You cannot do high volume, high intensity, high frequency. It can't be done. If you think you can, send me the video. Low volume, low intensity, low frequency will not generate a training effect, so it's useless. Everything in between, you can come up with different combinations that will probably be workable or effective, where probably at least one of these variables has to be high, and the other 2 can be low or medium, but again, it depends. Again, exercise choice does play a role here. Like, could you do a high volume of high intensity squats 3 times a week? No. Could you do a low volume of high intensity squats multiple times per week? Yeah, probably. I mean, y'all couldn't do it because you don't have what it takes to do high intensity squats, but I think you see the point I'm making and start to see how these variables can interact. Could you do a high volume of high intensity barbell curls 3 times a week? Yeah, probably. A lot of guys do. They have big arms. So clearly proof of concept. Anyway, rather than trying to explain this in the abstract, I think it'll be easiest to just look at some examples of real-world training that's been used over the decades, which will show how these variables can fit together, and I'll use it to illustrate places where failure may not only be effective, but may be appropriate and actually may be ideal, or not. Let's go. So let's start by looking at sort of the classic steroid-driven training of the 70s that like Arnold and Lou Ferrigno and Franco and those guys used. So fairly commonly, a muscle group we train once a week. Intensity is a little hard to call on that. They clearly trained hard. They were not to failure, but it's tough looking at the videos to really say. Maybe 2 to 3 reps in reserve. And the volume per muscle group was very high, usually 3 to 4, even 5 exercises per muscle group, 4, 3, 4, 5 sets, so at least 20 sets per muscle group in total. So you see kind of how these start to interact. Volume per muscle group was high. The frequency was low, right? So volume went up, frequency went down. Again, intensity harder to call based on what the videos of them training do. Probably medium, because you can't really do a high volume of high intensity training. Maybe their last set was closer, as I've described, but you get what I'm getting at. Interestingly, the old bodybuilders of old talked about how those last 3 challenging reps were the growth reps, which is kind of what the effective reps model is describing scientifically. But there's one option Notice one thing has to be high, but the other variables have to be adjusted to account for that. So somewhat similar, but really not, we have the training of Dorian Yates, Blood and Guts, which was influenced very heavily by the training of Mike Menser, who was influenced very heavily by Arthur Jones, who I'll talk about next. So similar to Arnold, Dorian trained each muscle group once per week, so the frequency was low. The difference, or a difference, was that his intensity was much higher. Now, the HIT guys claim him as doing one set's failure, but that's not really true. He did multiple sets per exercise, usually pyramiding up over a couple of sets to one top sets to muscular failure. And I put up some videos of him, and it was low volume failure. He would usually grind out a couple reps, a little help from a spotter. As soon as he started to fail, he would be done. He also accounted for training to failure with a lowered volume, doing maybe 4 sets per muscle group. He typically did like 3 or 4 exercises per muscle group, depending, and he would work up to that one top set. And I dare say Dorian did all right for himself using this style of training. But again, by choosing to train to failure, his intensity went up. He accommodated for that by training at a lower frequency and also a lower per workout volume. So again, you can see as one goes up, something else has to come down. And yeah, as a pro, he was on steroids, but so was Arnold, and so was Ronnie, and so was everybody else at the pro level. My point being that, despite training to failure, which is apparently bad, he did okay. He won, 6, 7 Olympias? So maybe it's worth considering that training to failure isn't as bad as people make it out, given that you adjust the rest of the training for it. I'm just saying. So since in a way it actually stimulated what Dorian would end up doing decades later, let's go back to the original Arthur Jones stuff as he published in Nautilus Bulletin 1, his early training idea, before they got co-opted and bastardized by Mike Menser and Super Slow in the cult of HIT, because it shows an even more complicated interaction of these. So sort of the baseline Arthur Jones workout was you trained full body 3 times per week. The intensity was high, so you went to muscular failure, which as far as I can tell was low volume failure. So looking at volume, per workout, the muscle group volume was low at only 3 sets. And per week, the per muscle group volume was medium at 9. And what I think this illustrates is that you can have medium values for each. It doesn't have to be high, low, low, or high, low, high, or low, high, high, or whatever. This is kind of like the intensity was high per workout and per set. However, the per workout volume was low and the per week volume was low and the frequency was medium or high, depending on what you want to call 3 times per week. And if I'm honest, if the average person in the gym right now did something closer to what was in Arthur Jones's original work and just did 9 sets per week to concentric failure, they would get so much more done and make so much more progress than the 2.5 hour faffing about workouts they do currently because they follow drug users who just pump for 1 million sets on YouTube and who just increases their doses and then add growth hormone so they can get that 10 pounds of extra muscle this year. You know who I'm talking about. So following that, let me talk about Doggcrapp training, which is created by Dante Trudell, back in, let's say, the mid-2000s. Because it's an even slightly more complicated example of all of this, again, also using failure. So at least in sort of the typical program, the frequency per muscle group is every 5th day, so 3 times every 2 weeks, which is relatively low. The intensity, however, is actually, I guess, would be considered super maximal because it's based around drop sets. So you do a set to concentric failure, take 15 to 20 breaths, and then do a mini set of whatever, 3 to 4 more repetitions, 15 to 20 breaths, do another mini set. There might be a third one. I'd have to go back and look. Very similar in concept to Borge-Fagerli's myoreps, although a little bit more failure-oriented. So the intensity actually is extremely high. And if you go back and look at the original videos I put of myself training to failure, that was the style of training I was using. However, the volume per muscle group per workout is fairly low. Typically, you would do maybe 2 exercises per muscle group or 2 sets per muscle group. That would be followed by a loaded stretch, which I personally think is more of a heavy eccentric. That's neither here nor there. So maybe call it 3 sets per muscle group per workout, which makes it 9 sets every 2 weeks, which is a pretty low training volume. But once again, you see how these things kind of interact. He goes to actually past failure, but keeps the per workout volume low and the muscle group frequency even lower to account for that. So this is a random note. Dante once wrote that the reason he developed this training style was he wanted to generate the maximum growth stimulus in the minimum training volume, because he felt that volume, doing 8 or 10 or 20 sets per muscle group, was a far bigger issue in overtraining than doing a much higher intensity with a lower volume and a lower frequency. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that he's right or wrong about that. I'm just making the point. And in sort of a similar vein, you've got Dr. Scott Stevenson's fortitude training, which is high frequency, and I'll come back to that, but is 2 days out of the week, you do what he calls muscle rounds, which is a heavy loading sort of mini set approach where you do repeat sets of, I think, 6 with a 10-second break. And he mentions that part of the goal of this is to stress the muscle as much as possible without doing an excessive volume of training. The simple fact is that Doggcrapp has produced winning pro bodybuilders. So Mike, before you prattle on about failure or come at me, maybe there's something to learn from this. And maybe thinking about this a little bit more might allow you to win that plastic first place trophy that you've so far failed to get in the last 10 plus years. And I'm not saying you should train Doggcrapp. I'm making a point about how it is set up. If Doggcrapp has a major drawback, it tends to burn people out with the constant failure training, because even the cruise weeks are to failure. As well, to make a low volume system like that work, you have to be willing to work. You have to be really willing to work to limits past your discomfort level. And the fact is, most of y'all can't do it. And even if you could, maybe you don't want to. Maybe you just don't like, working hard towards a goal, and that's fine. The only way to make low volume training work is that you have to be willing to push to this level of intensity. If you're not willing to do that, or you're not wired to do that, you're going to have to do something else, and that's fine. So way back in probably the early 2000s on my old forum, I wrote a workout program that I called the generic bulking routine. It was aimed at early to like mid-level intermediate. So, first after year 1 or 2 of productive training. And it sort of split the middle on all of this. So it was set up as an upper-lower split with each workout done twice a week. So the frequency per muscle group was medium, 2 times per week. The intensity was medium-high, somewhere between 1 to 3 reps in reserve, at least to start. Like if you're doing 4 sets of an exercise, start at 3 reps in reserve, and that may again fall off, and the final set might be at 0. You might fail as a consequence of fatigue and working hard, but that was never a goal. Volume per workout was 6 to 8 sets per muscle group, so medium, and that was 12 to 16 sets per week, which was high. And I just note again that these numbers are basically consistent with all the current literature, what all of y'all fit pros are recommending in terms of about 10 to 20 sets per week on average, 1 to 3 reps in reserve. I wrote this, God, I guess it was 20 years ago now, so Mike, you can spare me the Lyle's old and out of touch stuff. Y'all are just now catching up to me. And I'm sure I could spend, forever looking at other training programs, endless variations on a theme. But I think at this point, you've kind of got the gist of what I'm getting at with not only what I talked about last video, but also just now. Within an individual workout, volume and intensity vary inversely. And this can be modified by exercise choice, which again, I don't want to get into in great detail. If you're going to do a low volume, you have to work at a high intensity. If you want to do a high volume, your intensity will be capped. If you work at a high intensity, there will be a limit to how much volume you can do. If you are unwilling or simply incapable of generating decent amounts of intensity, the volume you have to do to get a training effect will go up. As you get into weekly schedules, it gets more complicated because you can vary frequency, intensity, volume with individual workouts to achieve varying goals, depending on what you're trying to do, depending on who the person is, depending on what they like to do. If you're not someone who likes to push very hard and can't go to failure or doesn't know where it is, and trust me, none of y'all do, if you're not willing to push that hard, yeah, you're going to need to do more volume. That's fine, because that is another legitimate way to generate a training effect, and I'm not saying anything to the contrary, but that still avoids the point, which is, oh, failure is bad because. as I mentioned, the fit pros seem to be coming from this cretinous initial conclusion that volume is good and high volume is better, and then they have to back argue why failure is detrimental based on irrelevant studies that are non-ecological to the way people actually train that generate neuromuscular effects that have no relevance to bodybuilding. It's not that failure is bad or good or indifferent. That depends on context. It's that these people are simply trying to justify their bias and preconceived conclusion, which is also fine. But none of them are intellectually honest enough to put it in those terms. And if you're currently part of the high frequency fad, and have started from the premise that you need to train at a high frequency and a high per workout volume, then yeah, you better stay way away from failure. And I hope you've got lots of drugs. In that vein, I should mention fortitude training again, because as much as I think high frequency is a fad, his system is a high frequency system where you train a muscle group 4 times per week. However, 2 of those workouts are the heavy loading muscle rounds, the intense training. It is also a low volume of training, right? Intensity goes up, volume comes down. But the other 2 workouts are pump training. They are lower intensity. That is another valid way of setting this up, and it shows the complexities. The other assumption that seems to be made is you either train to failure or you don't. And since failure is bad, you shouldn't train to failure. What if on Monday you do a low volume and train to muscular failure, and then Thursday you do a higher volume of pump work away from failure? The fatigue is gone by 3 or 4 days anyway. It's not. Small changes in barbell velocity don't matter for sets of 12 to 15 in the frickin' barbell curl when you're pumping it up. For goodness sake, people, so much has been made out of this difference that only applies to athletes. This is bodybuilding. There are unlimited ways to set this up, and there are unlimited systems that have worked depending on what you want to do. And I've never said anything different. My point with all is simply that the assertion that failure is bad because, based on these dumb studies, is incomplete. It's inadequate, and the way it's being presented is simplistic. And simplistic is always wrong. Just like the online fitness industry. Simplistic and wrong. All right, let's start to wrap this nonsense up. So when is training to failure appropriate? Well, I've addressed a lot of the issues, but I kind of want to sum them up here. Probably the easiest is that when training volume is low, by choice or by necessity, you must train very close to or at muscular failure. Otherwise, it's not a training effect. Even the most myopic fit pros will be like, well, training to failure can be bad, but if you want to do it on the final set of an exercise or of a workout, that's fine. Okay, no problem with that. Okay, there are other people that recommend doing an AMRAP at the end of every workout for specific exercises. I've even seen this in some powerlifting systems. What's funnier is they recommend a squat or a deadlift AMRAP. Yeah, send me the video, guys. As many reps as possible in the squat or deadlift. Yeah, more like as many reps as you're willing to do. What's funny about that is I've never even advocated training to failure that frequently, either at the end of the 4th set of every exercise. Again, it may occur due to fatigue, but that was never a goal in my routines. Certainly, I've never done it with my powerlifter, AMRAP, squat, and deadlift. Oh, for God's sakes, you've got to be kidding me. Other people in this industry advocate failure way more than I ever have. And yet, in his pathetic attempt to dismiss me, Mike claims I advocate training failure for everybody under every situation. Mike, you're a pathological liar. So that's number 2. Other fitness professionals, not me, will recommend, that you can or should or whatever take the final set of a given exercise to failure consistently or do an AMRAP in the squat or deadlift. Yeah, okay, fine. All right, next up. Every trainee, assuming they're going to try to use a reps and reserve approach or whatever, has to spend some time training to actual failure. There is no disagreement to be had here. If you've never trained actual 0 reps in reserve or beyond that to muscular failure, you do not know where it is. And I'm just going to stop asking y'all to send me videos to prove me wrong, because clearly you're not going to. You're all cowards who know I'm right, and you'd rather make excuses than admit it. simple fact, and I base this on nearly 30 years in commercial gyms, is that almost none of y'all have ever gotten to a true 0 reps reserve or muscular failure. Mike sure as hell hasn't. Those videos he put up claiming he was taking a trainee to 0 reps reserve was nowhere close. It's real simple. If the bar didn't slow, you didn't get anywhere close to 0 reps in reserve, much less muscular failure. So that's number 3. To learn what failure / 0 reps in reserve actually is so that you can anchor training to it. Well, let's say I started coaching someone who wanted to be a bodybuilder or a powerlifter or whatever, and day one, I would spend the first 6 months working on proper exercise technique, figuring out what were good exercises for them based on body type and things of that nature, getting them to feel the muscles that were involved, breathing, cadence, etc. That'd be like the first 6 months. At that point, I would put them through 2 or 3 months, or however long it took, of actually learning to push to muscular failure. And I would pick easier, safer exercises, curls or machines, and just start pushing them a little bit harder. Because learning to push to failure is a skill. And then they would be doing it on more complex exercises, learning to maintain technique in the face of fatigue, because they have to know what that means. You have to know what 0 reps reserve is to know what 2 to 3 reps reserve is. And once they've learned that, then I can write them a workout that says train this at 3 reps reserve, and they'll actually know what I mean in a way that none of y'all do. Now, from that point on, depending on how their training was going, I might almost never have them deliberately go to muscular failure. Again, I rarely have. Again, keep in mind the context. If they want to do low volume, that's different. If they want to try the Doggcrapp system, that's different. But if I'm going to use like my generic bulking routine as some of the routine regressions I use, failure is not going to be a consistent part of their training, because it never has been in the workouts I've written over 20 years. Now, what happened next depends on whether I'm coaching them hands-on or from a distance and writing them workouts. If I'm coaching someone hands-on, I am watching bar speed, technical stability, proficiency to make the decision when to add weight, because that's what coaching is. And even if I wasn't a great athlete, Mike, I'm a fantastic coach, which is why I have an athlete that has accomplished stuff athletically, and you're still an also-ran. But I'm going to do another video later about how I would coach you. However, if I'm not coaching them hands-on and I'm writing them workouts from a distance, every 3 to 4 weeks, I might have them take the final set of an exercise to muscular failure as a test. That's one of my heuristics to go, yeah, and I've explained it, if you get so many reps above your target, it's time to add weight. And I do that a lot of times in the consultations to give people a way of testing every so often when it is time to go up. But like I've said, that would be me recommending failure way less than all these other people in the industry. And depending on how skilled they are with reps in reserve and bar speed and stuff, they might not even need to use that test. But it's still, even then, a good spot check every once in a while. Just kind of remind them what a true limit set actually is. No different than having a fitness competitor diet or spot check their diet every once in a while. But that would be the 4th time I might recommend failures, just as an occasional test, maybe every 3 to 4 weeks once they're in their intermediate stage, to make sure that they're not sandbagging. And then I guess the converse is, the corollary is, when should you abjectly avoid failure? Obviously, if you want or are choosing to do a ton of volume in either a given workout or a given week, then you're going to need to stay pretty far from failure for the grand majority of those sets. If you're just incapable of pushing that hard, yeah, you better do a bunch of volume to compensate for your lack of focus and intensity. Again, if you want to be on that high training frequency fad, then yeah, you should probably keep most of your sets away from failure, especially if you're going to try to do high volume, high frequency, in which case the high intensity nature should be your drugs. But once again, Scott Stevenson's fortitude training uses high frequency with 2 workouts that are extremely intense and 2 that are pumpier by using a low volume per workout. So even high frequency is not an absolute condition for staying away from failure. It depends. And even though I didn't really get into the details, like obviously on complex compound exercises, squat, deadlift, less so bench, going to failure, most of all, y'all don't have what it takes, but it can be dangerous. So I would probably definitely recommend not doing it. It can be done. I've done it. I've put up videos of people doing it, but y'all can't do it safely. And even though I'm really focusing on bodybuilders, yeah, when you're training athletes, it's a whole different set of circumstances, because you are having to worry about things like movement speed and technique and technical quality, which is why I don't take my powerlifter to failure, because I have to worry about fatigue management for her. We're talking about hypertrophy and bodybuilding For God's sake, you don't need to worry about counter movement jump. Y'all don't even mostly know what it is. I'm sure if I sat down and thought about it for even longer than I already have, I could come up with another example or two. But whatever, you get the point. There are times failure is appropriate or required, and there are times it should be absolutely avoided, which brings me to my final point. So assuming you made it through all this, hopefully you got 2 major points out of it. 1, whether failure is good, bad, indifferent, recommended, required, or should be abjectly avoided depends on the context, like everything else. Diet, supplementation, it's all context specific. The training volume, both per workout and per week. The training frequency, the exercise being done, the individual in question and their psychology. And all these other, whether they're dieting or not, all these other variables play a role in whether or not failure is good, bad, or not, indifferent. That's point 1. If you can't understand that, go watch it all again because you're having some real comprehension problems. Number 2, I'm not a pro-failure guy. I never have been in 30 years. I said, we used to tell the HIT guys back in the late 2000s that all that failure was causing more harm than good. That I've been represented as pro-failure is absurd. I put videos up demonstrating what it was. But nobody can go back and find where I said anyone should train that level. In fact, I said the exact opposite numerous times. I've just given you plenty of examples. Yeah, are there context-specific times I would advocate someone go to failure? Sure. Context. It depends. Which brings me to point 3. Mike Israetel is a pathological liar. He was so pathetically desperate to avoid admitting he was wrong about what 0 reps reserve was. He misrepresented me for video after video after video, finally saying that I advocated failure to all people for all goals. He knew better, and that makes it a bold-faced lie. Mike, if you're a man, and we both know you're not, and you have any guts or integrity, and we both know you don't, you go fix it. But as importantly, for the rest of y'all, if you're okay with his lies and don't expect him to go correct his mistake while you hold me responsible for stuff I said a decade ago that hurt your feelings, you're just as bad as he is. Because that makes you small-minded, insecure children who don't think that honesty is important or that anyone should be held accountable except for me. And that just makes y'all hypocrites. And you know I'm right. Demand that he fix the problem and hold him accountable, or realize that you're just as bad as he is. And that's the end, folks. Hopefully, talked about all the nuances of training and muscular failure, and I look forward to getting that N1 training goniometer so I can do a proper lateral raise. See you next time, guys.